Some secrets are never meant to be uncovered. Some truths are hidden so deeply that even those closest to us may never know them. When an aging millionaire, mourning the loss of his beloved wife, stumbles upon a little girl who refuses to remove her hat, he never expects the mystery that lies beneath. Why does she cling to it so desperately? Why does everyone around him seem determined to keep him from the truth? And what do the numbers 233B mean? As the past unravels, betrayals emerge, and shocking revelations come to light, one thing becomes clear: nothing is what it seems. Stay with us until the end of this heart-wrenching story, and don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The air in the cemetery was thick with the scent of damp earth and wilting flowers. Charles Whitmore stood motionless in front of the polished mahogany coffin, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his late wife's wedding ring between his fingers. The mourners had long since dispersed, leaving him alone with nothing but the whispering wind and the weight of his grief. Eleanor was gone. The woman who had stood by his side for over 40 years, the woman who had filled the empty halls of their grand estate with warmth and laughter, was now nothing more than a name carved into cold stone. "You always said I would outlive you," he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse from days of silence. "But you never told me what to do when you were gone." A gentle cough behind him startled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a stranger, a tall man dressed in a crisp black suit, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hat. The man tilted his head slightly, as if examining him. "Mr. Whitmore?" the man said, his voice calm yet laced with something unreadable. "My condolences." Charles gave a stiff nod, expecting the man to leave. Instead, the stranger stepped closer and lowered his voice. "She knew," he murmured. "She knew everything." Before Charles could ask what he meant, the man turned and walked away, disappearing among the gravestones before he could be stopped. A chill ran down Charles's spine. Who was he? And what did he mean? Still shaken, Charles left the cemetery and drove into town, hoping to clear his mind. He had no appetite, but he found himself stepping into a small diner on the outskirts of the city. It was a modest place. Checkered floors, worn leather booths, and the scent of fresh coffee hanging in the air. The kind of place Eleanor would have loved. He chose a quiet corner and sat down, but before he could even open the menu, he felt the weight of judgmental stares. A young waitress approached with a hesitant smile, but the moment she noticed his frayed coat and scuffed shoes, her expression shifted. Sir, are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, her tone polite but condescending. Charles frowned. "I'd just like a coffee." She hesitated, then walked away without another word. Moments later, a manager, a tall, sharp-eyed man with a stiff posture, approached. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a dress code," he said, eyeing Charles's simple attire. "A dress code?" Charles repeated, his voice flat. "We cater to a certain clientele," the manager continued. "Perhaps a place downtown would be more suitable." Charles clenched his fists under the table. He could buy this entire restaurant 100 times over. Yet here he was, being treated like he didn't belong. Eleanor would have laughed at the irony. She had always said that wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it for good. But what good was money when people only saw the surface? He stood without another word and walked toward the door, but just as he reached for the handle, a soft sniffle stopped him. In the farthest booth, nearly hidden by the shadows, sat a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7, her small frame curled against the worn leather seat. Her oversized gray hat drooped slightly over her eyes, and she hugged her arms tightly around herself as if trying to disappear. Charles glanced at the staff, expecting them to acknowledge her, but they all seemed to look past her, as if she weren't even there. He hesitated before approaching her table. "Are you waiting for someone?" She flinched at his voice but didn't answer. Up close, he could see the hollowness in her eyes, the way she clutched the brim of her hat with small, delicate fingers. "Would you like something to eat?" He tried again. Still, she said nothing. Instead, she simply shook her head and lowered her gaze. Before he could press further, the manager appeared behind him. "Sir, I really must ask you to leave. Charles turned, his patience thin. And the girl? Is she not welcome here either? The manager's expression barely changed. There's no girl here, sir. A cold shiver ran down Charles's spine. He turned back toward the booth. But she was gone. The seat where she had been sitting was empty, the indent of her small frame still visible in the leather. Charles felt his pulse quicken. He scanned the diner, but there was no sign of her. Had she run out the back? How had no one noticed? A thought struck him then, one that made his stomach tighten. Had she ever been there at all? That night, back at his grand, empty estate, Charles sat in his late wife's study, turning her wedding ring over in his palm. He should have gone straight to bed, but something in his mind wouldn't let him rest. Then he saw it. An envelope, tucked between the pages of an old book on Eleanor's shelf. His breath caught as he pulled it free, his name scrawled across the front in her familiar handwriting. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside was a single slip of paper. No letter, no explanation, just an address. And one word: truth. Charles sat in his study, staring at the piece of paper in his hands. The address written in Eleanor's delicate handwriting burned into his mind. It was a part of her he had never seen before. An unfinished thought, a message left behind with no explanation. Truth. That single word felt heavier than any fortune he had ever possessed. The night was quiet, too quiet. His grand estate, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt hollow. The fire in the fireplace crackled weakly, barely casting a glow on the walls lined with books Eleanor had loved. He ran a hand through his silver hair, trying to make sense of it all. Who was the girl in the diner? Why had no one else seemed to see her? And why had the words of that strange man at the cemetery been echoing in his head ever since? She knew everything. Something deep inside him twisted. Eleanor had always been an open book, gentle, kind, but also fiercely protective. Had she been keeping secrets from him? He glanced down at the address again. There was only one way to find out. The drive across town was long, the streets dark and empty. The address led him to a part of the city he had rarely visited, an older district where the buildings bore the weight of time. The orphanage stood on a quiet street, its iron gates rusted, the paint on the wooden sign peeling. Ridgeway Home for Children. The name felt strangely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Charles stepped out of his car, his breath visible in the cold air. The orphanage loomed before him, its windows dark except for a dim light flickering from inside. He hesitated, gripping Eleanor's letter in his pocket for courage, before stepping toward the entrance. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a modest lobby lined with old chairs and faded paintings. The place smelled of dust and something faintly medicinal. A woman sat behind a desk, her gray hair pinned back into a bun. She looked up from her paperwork, eyes narrowing slightly. "Can I help you?" Charles hesitated. He hadn't thought this far ahead. I believe my wife visited this place before she passed. Eleanor Whitmore." The woman's expression barely changed. "We don't disclose visitor records, sir." "Please," he said, his voice softer now. "I just need to know why she came here." The woman studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Come with me." She led him down a dimly lit hallway, the wooden floors creaking beneath their steps. Old photographs of children lined the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, some of them faded beyond recognition. They stopped in front of a door marked Records Room. The woman unlocked it, gesturing for him to step inside. The room smelled of old paper and ink. Stacks of files filled metal cabinets, each labeled with years dating back decades. The woman moved to a small drawer, pulled out a file and handed it to him. "This is the only record we have of Eleanor Whitmore," she said. Charles opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a visitor log. His wife's name appeared 3 times over the past year, but it wasn't the log that caught his attention. It was the name written underneath. Child #233B. His fingers tightened around the paper. "What does this mean?" The woman hesitated. "We don't use names for some of our older cases. Some of the children, don't have official records. We assign numbers to protect their identities. Charles felt his heart pound. And this child? Where is she now? The woman hesitated. I'm not at liberty to say. He knew she was lying. Frustration clawed at him, but before he could press further, the door creaked open. A small figure stood in the doorway. His breath caught. It was her, the girl from the diner. She stood there, silent, clutching the brim of her oversized hat with tiny fingers. Her dark eyes locked onto his, filled with something unreadable. The air in the room thickened. You're real, Charles murmured before he could stop himself. The woman behind the desk stiffened. You should leave, Mr. Whitmore. He barely heard her. He took a slow step forward. What's your name? The girl didn't answer. Instead, she took a shaky breath and tugged her hat down lower, as if trying to disappear beneath it. Charles turned back to the woman, his voice sharper now. You know something. My wife. She was here for this child, wasn't she? The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Whitmore, not all questions need answers. But that wasn't good enough. Charles looked back at the girl. His heart clenched at the sight of her, so small, so alone. Do you know who Eleanor Whitmore was? He asked gently. For a moment, the girl didn't move. Then, she gave the slightest nod. Charles exhaled shakily. The woman behind the desk straightened, as if realizing the conversation had gone too far. You need to leave now. Charles clenched his jaw. I'm not leaving without answers. The woman sighed, rubbing her temples. Then she did something he didn't expect. She reached into her desk, pulled out a worn envelope, and handed it to him. Your wife left this with me. I wasn't supposed to give it to you unless you came looking. Charles's hands trembled as he took it. His name was scrawled on the front. He ripped it open. Inside, there was only one thing. A photograph of Eleanor, holding a baby with the same oversized hat. His breath caught. What is this? The woman's expression softened. That is the question, isn't it? Charles turned back to the little girl. His mind spun, pieces clicking into place but still forming an incomplete picture. She stared at him, gripping her hat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Something deep in his chest told him he couldn't leave her here. And then, in the quietest voice, so soft he almost didn't hear, she whispered, She told me you'd come. A shiver ran down his spine. Charles swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life building an empire, making logical decisions, never taking risks. But this wasn't business. This was something else. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt truly afraid. The car ride back to the estate was silent. Charles gripped the steering wheel tightly. His thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and unease. The little girl sat in the passenger seat, her small frame barely filling the leather seat. She hadn't spoken since they left the orphanage, only staring out the window, clutching the brim of her oversized hat like a lifeline. Charles stole glances at her from time to time, his mind racing. She told me you'd come. Those words had cut through him like a knife. Eleanor had been there for her. She had known her. But why? He exhaled, gripping the photograph in his free hand. It was old, slightly creased, but the image was unmistakable. Eleanor holding a baby, this child. The estate came into view, its towering iron gates opening at the press of a button. The mansion stood like a relic of another time, its grand pillars and pristine gardens a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. As they pulled up to the entrance, the housekeeper, Margaret, emerged from the front door. Her sharp eyes flickered between Charles and the little girl, but she said nothing. Mr. Whitmore, she greeted, her voice laced with curiosity. I didn't expect company. Charles hesitated before stepping out. Neither did I. The little girl followed, her tiny steps hesitant as she looked up at the enormous house. Charles expected some reaction. Fear, curiosity, hesitation, but she remained unreadable. Margaret folded her arms. And who might this be? Charles didn't know how to answer. He barely knew himself. She'll be staying here, he said instead. Margaret's brow lifted. but she didn't question him. "I'll prepare a room." Inside, the house was as silent as ever. Eleanor's absence still lingered in every corner, an invisible presence that made the emptiness unbearable. Charles led the little girl into the grand living room, where the fireplace cast flickering shadows along the walls. She sat on the couch without a word, her hands gripping the hat tighter. Charles knelt in front of her, trying to soften his voice. "You never told me your name." She hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, "Lena, Lena." He repeated it in his mind, testing the sound. Fit her in a way. Soft, fragile, mysterious. "Lena," he said gently. "Did Eleanor, my wife, did she visit you often?" Lena nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the floor. Charles swallowed. "Why?" She hesitated. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she said, "I had to be patient, that you would come when it was time." A chill ran down his spine. Time for what? Lena's grip on her hat tightened. "To take me home." His breath caught. Eleanor had known. She had planned this. But why hadn't she told him? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Margaret reappeared, her usual composed expression tinged with something unreadable. "There's a man at the gate. He says he needs to speak with you." Charles frowned. "Who is he?" He wouldn't say, but he insisted it was urgent. Charles hesitated, then stood. "Stay here, Lena. I won't be long." As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a wave. A black car was parked just outside the gate, its engine humming softly. A man stood beside it, his posture rigid, his face hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. Charles approached slowly. "Who are you?" The man lifted his head. His eyes, sharp and knowing, locked onto Charles with unsettling familiarity. "I'm here for the girl." Charles's blood ran cold. "Excuse me?" The man took a step closer. "Her name is not Lena, and she does not belong here." Charles squared his shoulders. "Who sent you?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You shouldn't be asking the wrong questions, Mr. Whitmore. You should be asking why your wife kept this from you." Charles clenched his fists. "What do you know about my wife?" The man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was knowing. "More than you do." Charles felt something inside him snap. He was done with the cryptic answers, done with the riddles. He took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "If you don't leave now, I will make sure you regret stepping foot here." The man's smile didn't waver. Instead, he slipped a small card into Charles's hand. "When you're ready for the truth, you know where to find me." Then, without another word, he turned, got into his car, and drove away. Charles looked down at the card. A single number was printed on it, 233B. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned back to the house, his mind spinning. Lena, the orphanage, Eleanor's visits, and now this man. Everything was connected, and for the first time in his life, Charles was afraid of the truth. Charles sat in his late wife's study, the small card still clenched between his fingers. 233B. The numbers seemed to mock him, their meaning just out of reach. The man at the gate had disappeared into the night, leaving behind only more questions. Questions that Eleanor had taken to her grave. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting long shadows against the bookshelves. The room smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume, a ghostly reminder of her presence. He closed his eyes, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. He needed answers, but first he needed to know the truth about Lena. With renewed determination, he made his way upstairs. The mansion was silent except for the faint hum of the wind outside. He reached the guest bedroom and pushed the door open quietly. Lena was curled up on the bed, her small frame barely making an indent in the blankets. The lamp on the nightstand cast a soft glow over her delicate features. She was still wearing the hat. Charles sighed and stepped inside. "You should sleep," he said gently. She didn't open her eyes, but she shifted slightly. "Can I stay here?" The quiet vulnerability in her voice sent a pang through his chest. "Of course," he murmured. She hesitated, then whispered, Eleanor said you wouldn't leave me behind. Charles swallowed hard. I won't. A long silence stretched between them. Then, barely above a whisper, why do people lie? Charles stiffened. Who lied to you, Lena? She didn't answer. Instead, she gripped the brim of her hat tighter, as if it anchored her to something only she understood. He exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. Go to sleep. We'll talk in the morning. But as he left the room, he knew deep down that morning would only bring more questions. Sleep didn't come easily. Charles lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a storm of memories. Eleanor had hidden so much from him. This child, the orphanage, the mysterious number. And now, a stranger had come to his doorstep, claiming Lena didn't belong to him. What had Eleanor been involved in? And why had she never told him? Unable to rest, he got up and made his way to Eleanor's old writing desk. If she had hidden something, this was where he would find it. The drawers were filled with old letters, receipts, and notebooks filled with her neat handwriting. He sifted through them slowly, searching for anything that might give him a clue. Then, tucked at the bottom of the drawer, he found a locked wooden box. His pulse quickened. The key. The small key from the orphanage. He retrieved it from his coat pocket, his fingers trembling slightly as he fit it into the lock. Turned with a soft click. Inside the box were several old documents, folded neatly. He lifted the first one, his heart pounding. It was a birth certificate. Lena's birth certificate. But something was wrong. The last name had been erased. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He flipped to the next document, an adoption record. His breath caught in his throat. Eleanor's name was on it, but his wasn't. The realization struck him like a blow. Eleanor had adopted Lena without telling him. But why? And why had she hidden it? His hands trembled as he reached for the final document. It was a medical report, stamped with a hospital name that sent an icy chill through him. Ridgeway Psychiatric Institute. 233B. The hospital. The orphanage. Everything was connected, and Eleanor had known. Charles closed his eyes, his breath unsteady. He had spent his life believing he knew everything about his wife, but now he felt like a stranger in his own past. Lena wasn't just any child. She was the key to something much bigger. A soft knock on the door made him startle. Lena stood in the hallway, clutching her hat. Her eyes so impossibly deep, so knowing, met his. You found it, she whispered. Charles couldn't speak. She stepped forward, lifting her small hands, and placed them over his. You were never supposed to know. The words sent a shiver down his spine. Lena, he murmured. What are you hiding? She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly removed the small, crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. She held it out to him with trembling fingers. Charles took it, unfolding it carefully. The writing was faded, scribbled in Eleanor's familiar hand. Don't let them take her, no matter what they say. His blood ran cold. Before he could speak, the sound of a car engine rumbled outside. Headlights flashed through the window. Someone was here. Lena gripped his sleeve, her voice shaking. They found me. The hum of the car engine outside sent a chill through Charles's spine. He turned his gaze toward the window, the headlights illuminating the grand entrance of the estate, casting long shadows through the curtains. His heart pounded against his ribs. Lena's grip on his sleeve tightened, her small fingers trembling. They found me, she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Charles swallowed hard. Who? She shook her head, her dark eyes filled with something deeper than fear, resignation. As if she had been expecting this moment. As if she had always known it would come. Charles straightened, determination taking hold. He wasn't about to let some faceless stranger waltz in and take this child. Not when he still didn't understand why she was here, why Eleanor had fought so hard to protect her. Stay here, he told Lena firmly. Don't open the door for anyone but me. She hesitated but nodded, her tiny hands gripping the brim of her hat. Charles strode toward the front entrance, his breath steady, his mind racing. As he reached the door, he caught sight of Margaret, his housekeeper, peering out from behind the staircase. "Sir?" she whispered, concern etched in her face. "Stay with Lena," he instructed. "Don't let her out of your sight." Margaret hesitated before nodding, retreating toward the hallway. Charles exhaled deeply, then pulled the door open. A familiar figure stood under the porch light, his long coat slightly damp from the misty night air. The man from the orphanage. Charles's fingers curled into fists. "You again." The man's expression remained unreadable, his sharp eyes assessing Charles in a way that made him feel examined, dissected. "I warned you, Mr. Whitmore," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "You shouldn't have brought her here." Charles squared his shoulders. "You need to start explaining. Right now." The man's lips curved into something that might have been a smirk. "I believe you already know more than you should." Charles clenched his jaw. "Why was my wife visiting that orphanage? Why did she adopt Lena without telling me?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Because she didn't trust you." The words landed like a slap. Charles stiffened. "That's a lie." The man's gaze didn't waver. "Then why didn't she tell you?" A deep silence stretched between them, the night air heavy with unspoken truths. Charles's voice was low when he finally spoke. "What is 233B?" Something flickered in the man's expression, something close to amusement. "You think you want the truth," the man said slowly. "But I assure you, Mr. Whitmore, the truth isn't meant for you." Charles's patience snapped. "You listen to me," he growled, stepping closer. "That child is under my protection now. I don't care who you are or what you think you know. You're not taking her." The man regarded him for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose, as if almost impressed. "Very well," he said. "For now." Then, without another word, he turned, walking back toward the waiting car. Charles watched as the vehicle disappeared into the mist, tension still thrumming in his veins. Something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. When he returned inside, Margaret was sitting with Lena in the living room, a steaming cup of tea resting untouched in front of the little girl. She was curled up in the corner of the couch, her hands still wrapped around the brim of her hat. Margaret looked up as Charles entered, relief in her eyes. "Who was it?" Charles loosened his tie, exhaling heavily. "A man who thinks he knows more than he should." Margaret pursed her lips. "And does he?" Charles didn't answer. Instead, he knelt in front of Lena, his voice gentler now. "Did you know him?" Lena hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "Why are they looking for you?" Another hesitation. Then, barely above a whisper, "Because of what I am." Charles felt his stomach drop. He studied her carefully. "And what are you?" She clutched her hat tighter. "I don't know." Silence filled the room. Margaret cleared her throat. "Sir, I think you should read this." She handed Charles an old leather journal. He frowned. "Where did you find this?" Margaret's expression was unreadable. "Eleanor's study." It was tucked inside one of the drawers. Charles's breath caught. Slowly, he opened the first page. It was Eleanor's handwriting, and the first words made his blood run cold. "If something happens to me, keep her safe, no matter the cost." Charles sat back, his pulse pounding in his ears. Eleanor had known. She had known all along. Charles sat frozen in his late wife's study, the weight of Eleanor's journal pressing against his hands. The crackling of the fireplace seemed distant, a mere whisper against the deafening realization echoing in his mind. "If something happens to me, keep her safe, no matter the cost." Those were Eleanor's words, her warning, a plea written in delicate ink, left behind as if she had always known that one day he would find it. But why? Why had she kept this from him? His fingers trembled as he turned the pages. The familiar, elegant handwriting filled each sheet. But what unnerved him most wasn't just the words themselves. It was the urgency behind them. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I fear I may have been wrong. The truth is buried deep, but it is not gone. If he ever finds out, it will change everything." 233B. It was never supposed to exist. Charles's breath caught. That number again. The same one the man at the orphanage had mentioned. The same one scrawled across the mysterious documents tied to Lena. He exhaled sharply, shutting the journal. His mind was racing too fast, his pulse thrumming beneath his skin. He had spent decades believing he knew the woman he had shared his life with. But now he wasn't so sure. A soft rustling sound from the doorway made him turn. Lena stood there, clutching the brim of her hat tightly, her dark eyes unreadable. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Charles hesitated, swallowing down the storm of emotions clawing at his throat. "I should be asking you that." She shifted slightly but said nothing. After a long silence, he gestured for her to come closer. She obeyed hesitantly, her small feet barely making a sound against the polished wooden floor. When she was close enough, Charles set the journal aside and studied her carefully. "You told me before," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that they were looking for you because of what you are." Lena stiffened. Charles leaned forward. "What did you mean by that?" She lowered her gaze. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think Eleanor did." His heart clenched. "Of course she did. Did she ever tell you anything? About where you came from?" Lena hesitated. Then, finally, "She told me that I was special." Charles's breath hitched. "Special how?" She shook her head. "She never said. Just that people would want to take me away if they knew." A cold sensation crawled up Charles's spine. She had been hiding all this time, just like Eleanor had been hiding her. But from whom? And more importantly, why? His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden shrill ring of the house phone. Both he and Lena jumped slightly at the sound. Charles frowned, rising to his feet. He crossed the room quickly, lifting the receiver with steady fingers. "Whitmore Residence." There was a brief pause. Then, a voice, low, calm, eerily composed. "You shouldn't have taken her, Mr. Whitmore." Charles's entire body stiffened. His grip on the receiver tightened. "Who is this?" Another pause. Then, the voice continued, smooth as silk. "She doesn't belong to you." Charles felt a sharp pulse in his temple. "She's not a possession." The voice remained infuriatingly calm. "No, but she's not yours either." Charles inhaled deeply through his nose. "And who exactly do you think she belongs to?" The silence on the other end was deliberate. Then, "Ask your wife." A sharp click and the line went dead. A chill ran down Charles's spine. He slowly lowered the receiver, his hands cold despite the warmth of the fire nearby. Lena was watching him carefully, her small fingers still curled around the brim of her hat. "Who was it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles forced himself to breathe evenly. He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Someone who thinks they have a claim over you." Lena's hands tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Charles exhaled, running a hand over his face. This was getting deeper, darker than he had ever imagined. He needed answers, real answers. Without another word, he strode toward Eleanor's desk, grabbing the journal once more. He flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that might give him something concrete. And then he found it. A name. Dr. Evelyn Carter, Ridgeway Psychiatric Institute. His blood ran cold. Ridgeway, the same hospital tied to 233B. And now a doctor. Charles clenched his jaw. If Eleanor had written this name down, it meant she had trusted this person. And if she had trusted them, maybe, just maybe, they held the key to everything. The next morning, Charles barely touched his breakfast. Margaret watched him with careful eyes, occasionally glancing at Lena, who remained quiet throughout the meal. "Are you going somewhere today, sir?" Margaret finally asked. Charles set down his coffee cup. "Yes." Margaret arched an eyebrow. "And will you be taking Lena with you?" He hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Before he could answer, Lena spoke. "I want to go." Charles turned to her, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "This might not be safe," he warned. Lena held his gaze. "I don't think anywhere is safe." His stomach twisted. She was right. With a slow nod, he stood from the table. "Then we leave in an hour." The drive to Ridgeway Psychiatric Institute was long and uneventful. The hospital sat on the outskirts of the city, its towering brick structure standing against the overcast sky like a monument to forgotten secrets. As they pulled into the lot, Charles turned to Lena. "Stay close to me." She nodded. Together, they entered the building. The inside was just as foreboding as the exterior. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air, and the white-tiled floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights. A receptionist sat behind a desk, typing away on an old computer. Charles approached, clearing his throat. "I need to speak with Dr. Evelyn Carter." The woman barely glanced up. "Do you have an appointment?" "It's urgent," she sighed, finally looking at him. "Dr. Carter retired years ago. She doesn't take visitors." Charles's stomach dropped. "But," the receptionist continued, eyeing him more carefully now, "she still lives in town. If you're desperate enough, you might find her at her old house near the lake." Charles nodded, already turning back toward the exit. "Thank you." But just as he reached the door, Lena's small hand gripped his sleeve. "Look," she whispered. Charles turned, and then he saw it. A wall lined with old patient photographs, a history of Ridgeway's past, and among them, a black and white picture of children in hospital gowns. His breath caught, because standing among them, small, barely recognizable, but unmistakably her, was Lena. Charles felt the air rush from his lungs. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he stared at the photograph on the wall. The image was grainy, old, but there was no mistaking it. Among the group of children in hospital gowns, standing slightly apart from the others, was Lena. He took a slow, unsteady step forward, his gaze locked onto the picture. The photograph was dated almost 7 years ago. His mind reeled. Lena couldn't be older than 7 or 8 now. How could she have been here so long ago? His fingers trembled as he reached out, lightly brushing over the glass frame. The children in the picture all wore solemn expressions, but Lena's face was the one that unsettled him the most. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. She simply stared at the camera, her dark eyes deep and unreadable, much like they were now. A small voice broke his trance. "She lied to me." Charles turned sharply. Lena stood beside him, her gaze locked onto the picture, her hands clutching the brim of her hat. Her small body was tense, her face pale. Charles swallowed hard. "Who lied to you, Lena?" She hesitated, then murmured, "Eleanor." His breath caught. What did she lie about? Lena's fingers tightened around the hat. "She told me I had never been here before." Charles felt a sharp pang in his chest. Eleanor had hidden her, had protected her. But from what? Before he could press further, the receptionist cleared her throat. "Sir, I really can't let you linger here." Charles turned, his voice firm. "Where was this photo taken?" The receptionist frowned, glancing at the picture. "That's an old wing of the hospital. It was shut down years ago. No one's been there since." Charles didn't believe that for a second. "Take me there," he demanded. The woman hesitated. "Sir, that part of the building isn't open to the public. I'll make a donation." Charles cut in sharply, pulling out his checkbook. "Take me there." She hesitated a moment longer, but the weight of his name and his money was enough to make her sigh. "Fine, but if anyone asks, I never let you in." She led them down a narrow hallway, stopping in front of an old, rusted door. A large, restricted access sign was bolted across it. The woman fished out a set of keys, hesitated, then unlocked it. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. "Down that way," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone would see. "But I wouldn't stay too long if I were you." Charles gave a firm nod before stepping inside, Lena clinging to his hand. The moment the door shut behind them, the air changed. It was cold. The hallway stretched out before them, lined with peeling paint and broken light fixtures. The smell of dust and something faintly medicinal clung to the air. Lena stayed close to Charles's side, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. "Do you remember this place?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. A little. Charles swallowed hard. What did they do to you here? Lena's fingers tightened around his. They watched me, she whispered. A chill ran down his spine. Watched you? She nodded, her gaze flickering toward the doors lining the hallway. They asked me questions. Made me do tests. His stomach turned. Tests? His grip on her hand tightened protectively. And Eleanor? Did she know about this? Lena hesitated. I don't know. I don't think she wanted to. Charles's jaw clenched. Eleanor had tried to hide her. But from what? They reached the end of the hall, where a large, heavy door stood slightly ajar. Charles pushed it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the slivers of sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. Old furniture and scattered medical files littered the space. There were abandoned examination tables, rusted equipment, and papers strewn across the floor. Lena took a step forward, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. Then she froze. Her grip on Charles's hand went rigid. He followed her gaze. There, in the farthest corner of the room, stood an old metal filing cabinet. The doors were slightly ajar, and inside, yellowing files were stacked haphazardly. Charles felt something stir deep in his chest. Answers. He moved forward, pulling one of the drawers open. A wave of dust billowed into the air as he rifled through the files. Then his fingers stopped. His breath hitched. Patient file 233B. His hands trembled as he pulled it out, the thick folder filled with stapled reports and handwritten notes. Slowly, he flipped it open. The first page was a medical assessment. Name, unknown. Patient ID, 233B. Date of birth, classified. Status, experimental case. His vision blurred as he scanned further. Mental evaluations, cognitive testing, observations of unusual behavior. A sickening feeling crawled up his spine. These weren't just medical records. They were case studies, and Lena had been one of them. His hands tightened around the folder as he flipped another page. And then his entire body went still. There, at the bottom of one of the documents, was Eleanor's signature. A weight settled deep in his chest. Lena peered over his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. What does it say? Charles swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady. It says you were part of something. Something that was never supposed to happen. Lena was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost inaudible, was I a mistake? Charles's heart shattered. He turned to her immediately, kneeling so he was eye level. No, Lena, you were never a mistake. She searched his face, her dark eyes filled with something fragile. Then why did they make me go away? Charles exhaled sharply. He didn't have an answer. Not yet, but he was going to find out. He tucked the file under his arm and took Lena's hand once more. Come on, he said firmly. We're leaving. But just as they turned, a shadow moved outside the window. Charles's entire body went rigid. Someone was watching them. Lena gripped his arm, her breath hitching. Charles acted on instinct. He pulled her behind him protectively, his pulse hammering in his ears. He scanned the room, searching for another exit. Then a sound, the faint creak of the door behind them. Someone was here. Charles's stomach twisted. He turned sharply and came face to face with Dr. Evelyn Carter. She stood in the doorway, her piercing blue eyes sharp, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. Mr. Whitmore, she said smoothly, I was wondering when you'd come looking for me. Charles's pulse pounded in his ears. The dim light in the abandoned hospital room cast long, shifting shadows across the walls, and the silence was so thick it was suffocating. The woman standing in the doorway, Dr. Evelyn Carter, was poised, controlled, her sharp blue eyes flicking between him and Lena with unsettling precision. Lena's grip on his sleeve tightened. Charles didn't move. You've been looking for me? Dr. Carter said smoothly, stepping further into the room. Her voice was even, almost casual, but Charles didn't trust it. Not for a second. He straightened, his fingers tightening around the file still clutched in his other hand. I want answers. Dr. Carter smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I imagine you do. Charles's jaw clenched. Who is she? He nodded toward Lena. What did this hospital do to her? Dr. Carter's gaze flickered briefly to the child beside him. Lena stood perfectly still, her fingers curled tightly around the brim of her ever-present hat. Her dark eyes locked onto the doctor. Dr. Carter exhaled softly. I suppose you've figured out by now that Eleanor knew everything. Charles felt something tighten in his chest. She knew enough, he admitted, but not enough to tell me the truth. Dr. Carter's expression didn't change. Perhaps she was trying to protect you. Charles stiffened. From what? Dr. Carter hesitated. Then, not from what? From who? A cold shiver ran down his spine. Before he could press her further, Dr. Carter gestured toward the file in his hand. You're holding the beginning of the truth, Mr. Whitmore, but it's far from the whole picture. Charles's grip on the folder tightened. Then start talking. Dr. Carter studied him for a moment before exhaling. She moved to the rusted examination table in the center of the room, brushing a layer of dust from its surface before perching on its edge. She folded her hands in her lap. Lena was part of an experiment. Charles's stomach twisted. He already knew that. The medical records had hinted at it. But hearing it spoken aloud made it feel even more real. Dr. Carter continued. She was never meant to exist, Mr. Whitmore. And yet, here she is. Charles's hands clenched into fists. She's a child, not an experiment. Dr. Carter tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Do you know why she always wears the hat? Lena flinched beside him. Charles inhaled sharply. Tell me. Dr. Carter's gaze flickered toward the child. Show him, Lena. Charles turned to the girl, his pulse quickening. Lena, you don't have to. But Lena was already reaching up. Her small fingers trembled as she slowly, carefully, lifted the brim of her hat. Charles barely had time to react before he saw it. The numbers, bold, black ink, tattooed against the delicate skin of her scalp. 233B. A sickening wave of realization crashed over him. Lena was the experiment. Dr. Carter's voice was soft when she spoke. She was part of a genetic study, one that was meant to be erased long before you ever found her. Charles swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe evenly. What kind of study? Dr. Carter hesitated, then finally said, We were trying to see if memory could be inherited. Charles's breath caught. Inherited? Dr. Carter nodded. Passed down. Not just biologically, but emotionally, psychologically. We wanted to know if someone could be born remembering things they had never experienced. Charles's mind reeled. That's impossible. Dr. Carter gave a small, humorless smile. And yet, she nodded toward Lena. Charles turned back to the child. She was staring down at the floor, her small hands gripping the edges of her sweater. You were watching her, Charles murmured. Studying her. Dr. Carter's expression remained neutral. And when the project was deemed unethical, it was shut down. All records were destroyed. The children were dealt with. Charles's stomach churned. Dealt with? Dr. Carter exhaled. The ones who survived were erased from existence. No names, no histories, just numbers. Charles's vision blurred with fury. And Eleanor. She took Lena before they could finish the job. Charles felt his entire world tilt beneath him. His wife, his Eleanor, had risked everything to save this child, and she had never told him. He inhaled sharply, struggling to stay grounded. So why come after her now? Dr. Carter's expression darkened. Because you went looking, Mr. Whitmore, and now they know where she is. A slow, sinking dread settled in Charles's stomach. Who are they? He asked, his voice low. Dr. Carter's gaze met his. The people who started this experiment in the first place. The ones who don't like loose ends. Silence filled the room. Charles turned to Lena. She was staring at him with wide, uncertain eyes, waiting, watching, to see what he would do. And at that moment, everything became clear. He had a choice. He could walk away. Forget everything. Let the past stay buried. Or he could protect her, just like Eleanor had, just like she had wanted him to. His fists clenched at his sides. His decision was made. He turned back to Dr. Carter. "Where can I take her?" Dr. Carter exhaled. "There's nowhere safe, Mr. Whitmore. Not unless you're willing to fight." Charles's jaw tightened. "Then tell me what I need to do." Dr. Carter studied him for a long moment. Then finally she nodded. "There's only one way to end this," she said. "You have to find out who started it." The drive back to the estate was silent. The sun had begun to set, casting long streaks of amber and crimson across the sky. Charles gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind spinning with the weight of everything he had learned. Lena was never supposed to exist. She was an experiment, a child erased from history. Eleanor had saved her, hidden her. But now, because of him, they had been found. Lena sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window. She hadn't said much since they left the hospital, and Charles didn't push her. He could still see the way she had hesitated before removing her hat, the way her small fingers trembled as the truth was exposed. 233B. The inked numbers were proof of everything she had endured. He clenched his jaw, an anger burning deep in his chest, an anger he hadn't felt in years. Who had done this to her? And why? Dr. Carter had given him one final warning before they left. Find out who started this, or they'll never stop. Charles knew what she meant. Whoever had been behind this experiment, whoever had tried to erase Lena's existence, was still out there. He glanced at Lena, his grip tightening on the wheel. He wouldn't let them take her. Not now. Not ever. When they pulled up to the estate, Margaret was waiting at the door, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet relief. "You've been gone a long time," she murmured as Charles ushered Lena inside. Charles sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We found something." Margaret's gaze flickered to Lena, then back to him. "And did you get answers?" Charles exhaled. "Too many, and not enough." Margaret pursed her lips but didn't press further. Instead, she reached out and gently placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. "Are you hungry, dear?" Lena hesitated, then gave a small nod. Margaret smiled softly. "Come, let's get you something warm." As she led Lena toward the kitchen, Charles took a deep breath. He needed a plan. Dr. Carter had given him one final clue before they left the hospital. A name. Lawrence Bradford. According to Carter, he had been one of the lead researchers at Ridgeway when the experiments first began. His name had been wiped from the hospital's records, but Dr. Carter had managed to track him down. He lived in a small town an hour outside the city. If anyone had the answers Charles needed, it was him. He turned toward his study, already pulling out his phone to make arrangements. But before he could dial, he felt it. Presence. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned. Lena stood in the doorway, her dark eyes fixed on him. Charles inhaled deeply, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "You should eat something, Lena." She didn't move. Then, in a quiet, fragile voice, "Are you going to leave me?" Charles's chest tightened. He stepped toward her, lowering himself to her eye level. "Never," he said firmly. Lena searched his face as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. After a long moment, she nodded. Charles exhaled slowly. "I have to go somewhere tomorrow, to find answers. But I promise I'll come back." Lena hesitated, then whispered, "Can I come with you?" Charles's instinct was to say no. It wasn't safe. But then he saw it. The way she gripped the fabric of her sweater, the flicker of fear behind her steady gaze. She didn't want to be left behind. And deep down, Charles knew neither did he. He sighed, nodding. "All right, but you stay close to me." Lena's shoulders relaxed. "Okay." That night, as Charles sat in his study, staring at the name scribbled on a slip of paper, Lawrence Bradford, he knew that tomorrow, everything would change. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready. The next morning, the air was crisp as Charles and Lena drove toward the outskirts of the city. The address Dr. Carter had given him led to an old, weathered house at the edge of a desolate field. It looked abandoned, shutters hanging loose, paint peeling, the once white fence now gray with time. Charles pulled up to the gravel driveway, his stomach knotting with unease. "Stay in the car," he instructed Lena. She didn't argue. He stepped out, walking toward the house. Each step felt heavier than the last. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Charles frowned. He reached for the doorknob and turned. The door creaked open slowly. Charles hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of old paper and forgotten memories clung to the walls. Stacks of books and yellow documents littered the tables, and in the farthest corner of the room, slumped in an armchair, was a man. His hair was white, his skin gaunt. His eyes, once sharp, now held the weary look of someone who had spent too many years running from ghosts. Lawrence Bradford. The man lifted his gaze slowly, studying Charles with quiet recognition. "I was wondering when someone would come," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in a long time. Charles took a step forward. "You know who I am?" Bradford gave a weak, humorless chuckle. "You're Eleanor's husband." Charles stiffened. "Then you know why I'm here." Bradford exhaled slowly. "I know why you think you're here." Charles's patience was wearing thin. "I need answers." Bradford studied him for a long moment. Then, "You're not the first person to come looking for the truth." Charles's jaw clenched. "And what happened to the others?" Bradford's expression darkened. "They didn't like what they found." A slow, sinking dread settled in Charles's stomach. He didn't care. He needed to know. What was 233B? Bradford's gaze flickered toward the doorway. Charles followed his line of sight. Lena. She had stepped inside, despite his instructions. Bradford's expression softened. And then, barely above a whisper, "It was never an experiment." Charles's pulse pounded. "What do you mean?" Bradford inhaled sharply, as if the weight of the truth had been locked inside him for too long. "Lena wasn't created in a lab, Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly. "She was taken." Charles's stomach dropped. "What?" Bradford's gaze darkened. "The children, all of them, they weren't test subjects. They were stolen." A wave of nausea crashed over Charles. Eleanor had rescued Lena, but from where? Or worse, from whom? Bradford's voice was barely audible when he spoke again. "The real question isn't who started this." Charles felt his hands tremble. Bradford exhaled deeply, locking eyes with him. "It's why." And in that moment, Charles knew that everything he had believed, everything Eleanor had told him, had been a lie. The weight of Lawrence Bradford's words settled over Charles like a crushing force. The children, all of them, they weren't test subjects. They were stolen. His breath caught in his throat. He turned to Lena, who stood frozen in the doorway, her small frame barely illuminated by the dim light filtering through the dust-covered windows. She clutched the brim of her hat as if it were the only thing tethering her to the ground. Charles forced himself to speak. "You're saying Eleanor, my wife, she rescued Lena?" Bradford exhaled heavily. "She did more than that." The old man shifted in his chair, his gaze dark with something unreadable. "Your wife found out about Ridgway's secret years ago. She knew the truth, that the experiments weren't just science, that the children in that hospital weren't born in a lab. They were taken, stolen from families who never knew what happened to them." Charles's stomach twisted. "Why?" Bradford's jaw tightened. "Because they were different." Silence filled the room. Charles shook his head. "Different how?" Bradford's gaze flickered to Lena. "You've seen it, haven't you? She remembers things she shouldn't. She knows things she's never been told." Charles swallowed hard. He had seen it. The way Lena anticipated things before they happened. The way she seemed to know him before they ever met. The way she whispered things in the night, things she shouldn't have known. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Bradford leaned forward, his voice low. "They weren't studying genetics at Ridgway, Mr. Whitmore. They were studying memory." Charles's hands curled into fists. "Dr. Carter told me that." Bradford shook his head. "No, she didn't. She told you part of it. The convenient part. Charles's pulse pounded. Then tell me the rest. Bradford exhaled. They weren't testing if memory could be inherited. He hesitated, then locked eyes with Charles. They were testing if it could be transferred. The words sent a jolt through Charles's spine. Transferred? Bradford nodded. Imagine if you could take a person's memories, their entire life's experiences, and put them into someone else. Not just knowledge, but everything. Emotions, fears, dreams, regrets. Charles's heart pounded. That's not possible. Bradford's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. And yet, it worked. A wave of nausea hit Charles. He turned to Lena. Is that why they wanted you? She hesitated before nodding. They made me remember things. Things that weren't mine. Charles inhaled sharply. What kind of things? Lena swallowed. People. Places. Things I've never seen. But I know they were real. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. Sometimes, when I dream, I see her. Charles stiffened. Who? Lena's voice was barely above a whisper. Eleanor. The ground beneath him might as well have disappeared. His chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Lena had never met Eleanor. She had never even seen a photograph of her. And yet, she remembered her? Bradford sighed. Your wife tried to stop them, Mr. Whitmore. She tried to shut down the program. And when she couldn't, she took Lena. Charles clenched his jaw. Then why didn't she tell me? Bradford hesitated before saying, because she knew you wouldn't believe her. Charles felt like the world was unraveling around him. His wife had spent years hiding a truth he had never even known existed. She had risked everything to protect Lena, and she had died keeping that secret. Bradford sat back. And now, the people who started this? They want her back. Charles's pulse pounded. Then we have to run. Bradford's expression darkened. You don't get it, do you? You can't run from people like this. You can't hide. Charles straightened. Then what do I do? Bradford was silent for a long time. Then, you end it. Charles frowned. What do you mean? Bradford exhaled heavily. They need her alive. They need what's inside her. But if you expose them, if you make the truth public, she becomes worthless to them. A slow, chilling realization settled over Charles. Expose them. Destroy their entire operation. Take away their power. It was the only way to keep Lena safe. His gaze flickered to the little girl standing beside him, her fingers still curled around her hat. She had already endured so much. She had been erased from existence, stolen, experimented on. And yet she still stood, still fought, still survived. Charles's jaw tightened. He wouldn't let them win. He turned back to Bradford. How do I do it? Bradford hesitated. Then, finally, he reached into a drawer and pulled out an old, worn envelope. This, he said, handing it to Charles. Charles opened it carefully. Inside were names, dates, transactions. Every person involved in the experiment. Every scientist, every donor, every government official who had funded it. Bradford's voice was low. Take this to the press. Make it public. Charles hesitated. They'll try to stop me. Bradford's gaze darkened. They'll try to kill you. Charles's breath caught. Bradford sighed. But if you do nothing, they'll take her. And you'll never see her again. A silence stretched between them. Then, Charles closed the envelope, slipping it into his coat. Decision made. We leave tonight. Bradford gave a slow nod. Then you'd better move fast. The estate was eerily quiet when they returned. Margaret greeted them at the door, her gaze flickering between Charles and Lena. Is everything all right? Charles exhaled. Not yet. Margaret hesitated. What do you need me to do? Charles met her gaze. Pack. We're leaving. Margaret's lips parted slightly in surprise, but she nodded without hesitation. I'll take care of it. Lena tugged on his sleeve. Where are we going? Charles knelt beside her. Somewhere safe. Lena searched his face. Are you scared? Charles hesitated. Then finally he murmured, I am, but I won't let anything happen to you. Lena nodded slowly. She believed him. That night, as Charles loaded their belongings into the car, a chill ran down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder. The wind whispered through the trees. Someone was watching, but it didn't matter, because tomorrow the world would know the truth, and Lena would finally be free.